Every morning I was up before Robert. The kitchen light was always the first to flicker on. I'd brew a pot of coffee, fry 2 eggs, one for each of us, sometimes adding toast if the bread wasn't too stale. He liked his coffee black with a newspaper in hand. I'd set everything out neatly on the little table on the porch, then call him in for breakfast. Today was no different. "Breakfast's ready," I said softly, placing the plates on the table. He was sitting in the wicker chair on the porch, eyes on the paper. He looked up at me, then back down. Not a word. He folded the paper and walked in, slow, like he had nowhere to be. I thought maybe he'd nod. Something. But he didn't. He just sat, picked up his fork and started chewing. It hit me then. When was the last time we said anything over breakfast? He never took me to his friends' get-togethers. "You don't know them," he'd say. "You'd just be bored." He kept the checkbook to himself. "You don't get this stuff, it's just easier if I handle it." On my birthday he brought home a box of clearance chocolates from the grocery store. Tossed the trash on his way in and muttered, "Ran late today." For a long time I told myself he just wasn't good with emotions. But the truth? It wasn't about difficulty. It was about indifference. We weren't really husband and wife anymore. We were housemates. I cooked. I cleaned. I waited. I watched his moods like a weather forecast, always adjusting, day in day out. I wasn't his partner. I was the help. A live-in caretaker with a wedding ring. That afternoon he was sitting at the edge of the garage catching some sun. I had just come back from the store in town, lugging 2 bags filled with flour and eggs. I hadn't even stepped inside when I heard him call out. "Charlotte," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "Can you come here a sec?" I walked over. He was clutching his chest. His face was pale, beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. "Robert." I dropped the bags. My arms went to him instinctively. "Is it your heart? Did you take your meds?" He didn't answer. His body swayed forward in slow motion like a falling tree. I let out a sharp cry, catching him the best I could. I eased him down, grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I tried to remember the name of his medication the last time he saw a doctor. I sat in the ER waiting room for 3 hours, clutching the pill bottle he never got to open. When the doctor came out, he didn't even need to speak. His eyes said everything. He shook his head. Robert was gone. No note. No last words. Just gone. I couldn't describe what I felt. There was grief, yes. But also, God forgive me, a breath of relief. I know how cruel that sounds. But I was exhausted. I'd spent the last decade of my life tiptoeing around him, managing his blood pressure, logging his daily readings, driving him to the ER at 2 a.m., boiling oatmeal at 5 a.m. every single morning. And when he was in a bad mood, I didn't even dare ask what was wrong. And still he never once turned to look at me, really look at me. Back home I walked into the empty house. The silence echoed. His old coffee mug was still in the sink, stained and waiting to be washed. That's when I finally cried. Not because I had lost a husband, but because I realized I'd spent all these years, and I couldn't even say what it was all for. The funeral was simple. Just a handful of old friends came to see him off. I honored his request. No church service, no ceremony, just a small stone marker by the garden. His ex-wife didn't show up. But Michael did, wearing that dutiful stepson expression as he looked me in the eye and said, "He was always grateful for you." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he meant it. After he left, I stayed behind in the garden, sitting on the cold stone bench, my fingers tracing the edge of the marker over and over. The wind picked up, blowing strands of hair across my face, and suddenly I felt unbearably cold. For a whole month I didn't go near Robert's study. That door stayed closed, and every time I passed it I walked a little faster. Until one morning, for reasons I can't explain, I found myself standing right in front of it, hand on the doorknob, hesitating, then slowly pushing it open. The air was thick with dust and the stale scent of old paper. I opened the window, letting sunlight stream in. Then I grabbed the vacuum and began cleaning the carpet inch by inch. I wasn't doing it out of sentiment. I think I just needed to face something. But I never expected it to be a letter. I found it tucked in the back of an old drawer in the garage while wiping down the shelves. The envelope was sealed with a few words scribbled across the front. "For Charlotte, if I'm no longer here to hand it to you myself." I froze. Then slowly sat down on the floor and opened it. I thought maybe it'd be a note of apology. Or a few kind words of goodbye. I was wrong. There were only two things inside. A printed copy of his will, and his signature. I flipped through the pages, palms starting to sweat, heart pounding harder with every line. I leave my primary real estate property, namely my house, to my biological son Michael. My primary savings account and all liquid assets shall be placed into a trust, with Michael as sole trustee. To my spouse Charlotte I assign a goodwill allowance account, distributing $700 per month until the fund is depleted. Not a single thank you. Not one line of appreciation for the years I spent taking care of him. Not a thought for my situation. No house in my name. Just $700 a month. That's all I was worth to him. My own savings barely covered a few months of expenses. What was I supposed to live on? And then there was the final line. A sentence that cut into me like a blade. If you're reading this letter, I need you to know. This estate is the legacy of my life's work and I wish to leave it to my son. Not to anyone else. Not to anyone else. I sat there stunned as the letter slipped from my hands and landed on the floor. Sunlight hit that sentence, illuminating it with a brutal clarity. That's what I was to him. Someone else. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the kitchen step from dusk until dawn, hollowed out like someone had scooped the insides out of me. Before sunrise, a soft rain began tapping against the roof. The drops fell steady, rhythmic, like an echo of that cruel sentence ringing over and over in my mind. This estate. I wish to leave it to my son. Not to anyone else. I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes, but peace wouldn't come. All those years, what had I been doing? When he was sick, I was the one running to pick up his prescriptions. When he traveled, I answered his emails, soothed angry clients. Even when his distant relatives came by, it was me scrubbing the guest bedsheets, cooking meals, planning their stay. When his company hit a rough patch, I withdrew $20,000 of my own money to cover the shortfall. I never told him. Not once. Looking back now, I wonder, was I a fool? I remembered that time I was in the hospital for gallstones, standing in line for tests, and he told me he couldn't pick me up because he had a dinner he couldn't miss. I took a cab home. At the time I didn't think much of it. I figured, when you're older your body is your own responsibility. Turns out marriage is too. I once asked him, just once, have you ever thought about what happens later on? I mean, when it's just you and me getting older. He didn't even look up from his desk. Don't worry, he said. I've got it all handled. Now I know what he meant by handled. He meant erasing me from the picture. I started to understand that all those years of taking care of things for me weren't acts of love. They were acts of quiet dismissal. He never saw me as family. I was just the one who did the chores. A temporary guest in his life. Maybe not even a guest. Just the housekeeper. By the time the sun came up, I had splashed some cold water on my face and made a couple slices of toast. I bit into one, but it tasted like cardboard. Later that morning, I ran into Nancy, my old neighbor, at the grocery store. She gave me a warm smile. How've you been holding up? It must be tough adjusting to being alone after Robert passed. I forced a smile. I'm managing. Just taking my time going through his things. She nodded, then leaned in slightly, voice low. I heard Michael's taking over the house? I froze. Who told you that? He stopped by the local real estate office last week, she said. I guess he was asking about the property's market value. Said he was starting the inheritance process. The bag of groceries nearly slipped from my hands. That afternoon I sat in my car for half an hour doing nothing. Engine running. Music playing. An old tune came on the radio, Yesterday Once More, but in my ears it sounded like mockery. I called Michael. Asked him to meet. We need to talk, I said. About your father's will. He paused but agreed. Said he'd meet me at the cafe in town. I arrived 15 minutes early and ordered a black coffee I never touched. When he walked in, he looked just like always. Perfectly pressed gray suit, hair slicked back, posture like he was walking into a job interview. He nodded at me. Charlotte. I gave a dry smile. Still so polite. Still so distant. He shrugged. That's what you always wanted, wasn't it? Mutual respect and space. I pulled the copy of the will from my bag and laid it on the table, trying to keep my voice even. Michael, you know what your father left behind. You know what his plans were. He gave a faint smile. Of course. He and I talked about it often. He was a man of foresight. He did what was best for the family. He left me with next to nothing, I said, locking eyes with him. Do you not see how unfair that is? You lived in his house for over a decade, he said, casually stirring his coffee. That's more than fair. You weren't family. The words hit me like a slap. My blood seemed to freeze in place. So that's how you see me? I whispered. Not part of the family? Michael's smile was cold. Charlotte, to us, you were always an outsider. My hands trembled as I gathered the papers. I didn't say another word. I drove across town straight to Kathy's cafe. As I parked, I saw her through the window clearing mugs off a table. She spotted me and her smile instantly turned to concern. She came rushing outside. What happened? You look pale. My throat was dry. I don't know where to go. I just know I can't go back there. Not alone. She brought me inside, cranked up the heater and placed a cup of hot cocoa in my hands. Tell me, she said softly. What happened? I told her everything. From Robert's death to the will. To Michael's words, you're not blood. She didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when I finally finished, she leaned in and said, you spent all those years living for him. Taking care of him. Maybe now, it's time to live for yourself. I gave a bitter laugh. I'm over 60. What could I possibly start now? She looked at me, really looked at me. You can still fight for what's yours. Even if it's just a little. It still matters. And in that moment something clicked. It wasn't that I couldn't do anything. It was that I had never been allowed. But now I was going to allow myself. The next morning, Kathy went with me into the city. She said she knew a lawyer, Deborah. Used to be a judge, now ran a quiet private practice near the old courthouse, working mostly with seniors on estate disputes, long-term care issues, that sort of thing. I hesitated at first. Not because I didn't trust her, but because of something deeper. Shame, maybe. I'd lived my whole life never imagining I'd one day walk into a law office. Not to make a will, but to challenge one. To sit on the edge of a legal battle over someone else's idea of what's fair. But Kathy said something that cut right through the fog. You're not fighting for money. You're asking for justice, for everything you gave and never got back. Deborah was younger than I expected, maybe mid-50s. Short, no-nonsense haircut. Half-rimmed glasses. She spoke slowly, clearly. No fluff, but every word landed. She asked me to start from the beginning. So I did. Robert's death. The will. Michael's reaction. Everything. He took notes the whole time. Sometimes nodding. Sometimes raising an eyebrow. Never interrupting. Never judging. When I finished, she picked up the printed copy of the will I'd brought and went through it page by page. Then she looked up and asked me a few questions. Were there witnesses? Was it notarized? Did you and Robert ever sign any formal agreement dividing your marital assets? I answered as best I could. At the end, she gently set the documents down and said, this will isn't necessarily invalid, but it has procedural vulnerabilities. My eyes widened. What do you mean? First, she said, Robert used an online template. No legal review. The witness signatures are inconsistent. Second, he didn't clearly specify how the marital assets, particularly the house, should be handled. Third, and most importantly, he attempted to reassign property that, under state law, would legally belong to you as his spouse. That requires your signed consent. And he didn't get it. My breathing quickened. So, he tried to cut me out but didn't do it right? Deborah nodded. He thought he was being thorough. But in trying to control everything, he left gaps. And those gaps, they're your doorway back in. I sat in silence, momentarily dazed. All my life I thought a printed will with a signature was final. But it wasn't. Look. I could ask. I could challenge. Deborah went on. What I'll need is your formal authorization. We'll investigate the deed transfer on the house, trace the financial movements in his accounts, and dig into how and when that trust was created. If we find signs of asset concealment or procedural flaws, we can act. I nodded, still trembling. Do I have a real shot? He smiled, just a small one, but it lit up the whole room. You may not win everything. But you're no longer without rights. I clutched the papers in my hand. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to accept the terms that were handed to me. I had a choice. I signed the power of attorney right then and there. Deborah said she'd begin gathering documents. Robert's bank statements, real estate records, trust setup paperwork. When we stepped out of her office, the sun was warm on my face. I held a carbon copy of the authorization form in my hand. Kathy slipped her arm through mine. Feeling any better? I nodded. Then added, not better exactly. Just not powerless anymore. She gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. That's called moving forward, Charlotte. That's more than enough. That night I made myself a simple dinner. After eating, I pulled out every document I could find related to the house, our bank accounts, and Robert's insurance policies. I laid everything out across the table. His old voice memos, his handwritten ledgers, even the prenup we'd signed together a decade ago. I went through them one by one. The parts one didn't understand I flagged to ask Deborah later. I wasn't trying to be a legal expert. I wasn't trying to prove I was capable. I just finally understood one thing. This time no one else could handle it for me. I had to know for myself. I had to deal with it myself. About a week later, Deborah called. She had preliminary results and asked me to come in the next afternoon. I arrived 10 minutes early. On the desk were several printed documents, neatly stacked beside a monthly transaction report from one of Robert's bank accounts. Deborah handed me the first file. Your husband initiated a property transfer intent form about 6 months before his death. The primary residence, your house, he intended to transfer ownership to Michael. I nodded. That didn't surprise me. But the deed still lists both our names, right? He never completed it. Correct. Deborah flipped to the next page. He completed the intent to transfer. It includes his signature and Michael's, but not yours. And most importantly, the county registrar never processed the title change. The property remains jointly held. I exhaled, trying to steady my nerves. So, does that transfer count? It doesn't, she said firmly. Under state law, any attempt to transfer jointly owned marital property without both spouses' consent is not valid. I stared at the document for a long time. Robert had even scribbled a note in the margin in his own handwriting. Complete transfer ICP so Michael can handle next steps. My palm went cold. That quiet exclusion, it stung all over again. Deborah slid another paper across the table. We also found the trust account he established. It's not a large amount, but the intent was clear. He meant to bypass your legal rights. I nodded slowly, jaw tightening. Okay. She pulled a form from her drawer. This is a preliminary motion of objection. We can file it with the court to request a freeze on the estate's assets and challenge the legitimacy of the unfinished transfer. I looked at her and said, no. Not yet. You want to wait? I want to see him first. Michael. Yes. I closed the folder. This time I want to tell him face to face he's not getting the house. Deborah paused, concern flickering in her expression. He won't take that lightly. Right now he's a legally unsettled heir. If you threaten his position, he'll hit back hard. That's exactly why I have to see him, I said. Let him hear it from me. I chose the same cafe downtown, the one where we last met. This time I arrived half an hour early, ordered a black coffee and took a seat by the window. In front of me were 2 copies of the documents Deborah had prepared. Michael walked in wearing the same gray suit, composed and polished, as if stepping into a business negotiation rather than a personal reckoning. He saw me and offered a faint smile. Charlotte, you seem to be in good spirits. I didn't respond. I pushed the documents across the table. Your father's property transfer agreement? It's not legally binding. The house still belongs to me, half of it anyway. His hand hovered over the papers but didn't touch them. The smile faded from his face. What's this supposed to mean? I've filed an objection. The court will freeze any transactions involving the house until a legal ruling is made. He leaned back in his chair, his tone sharpening. Are you threatening me? I met his eyes. Not a threat. A heads up. Don't get too comfortable. He picked up the papers and scanned them, frowning. Then gave a low, humorless laugh. So you're really going to throw away 10 years with my father over a piece of property? I answered quietly, those 10 years? I was the only one holding them together. He didn't reply. Just slammed the papers shut and looked at me with something colder than resentment. Recognition. I'll have my attorney get in touch, he said, standing to leave. I called after him, The court already has a copy of the documents, Michael. You'll be served soon. He paused in the doorway and glanced back at me, not like a stepson looking at a grieving widow, but like someone sizing up an opponent. He didn't say a word. Just walked out. I sat there gripping my coffee cup, my hands still trembling. I was proud. Proud of the woman I was becoming. 2 days later, Deborah called. His lawyer filed for a continuance. Said they need time to review the evidence. The court granted it, preliminarily. I blinked. What does that mean? It means they're stalling, she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. They won't confront you head-on. They'll wear you down. That's the game. I bit my lip. Didn't say a word. She continued, it's a common strategy in estate and divorce cases, especially with women like you. In your 60s. Emotionally isolated. Financially vulnerable. They're betting you won't last the fight. She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. Still, it hit me like a wave of ice water to the chest. That night, I kept refreshing the case status on the court's website. Nothing changed. No updates. No movement. The calls from Deborah slowed too. The whole process felt like it had sunk into quicksand. I had done everything I could to prepare, and now I was just stuck. Waiting. But I soon realized Michael wasn't done with me yet. It started with Helen, my neighbor, giving me a half-hearted nod while walking her dog. Her eyes lingered on me like she was trying to read something on my face. Then at the grocery store, the young cashier leaned in and whispered, Mrs. Smith, my mom said you're in some kind of legal thing? I froze. Sweetheart, where'd you hear that? She blushed, looked down. There's a thread on the town forum. Someone posted about it. I rushed home, opened my laptop, and clicked into the local community board. There was, second post from the top. Townhouse tension. Stepmom fights over estate, family home in legal limbo. Attached was a blurry photo of me and Michael at the cafe, taken from a distance but clear enough to recognize my face. Beneath the post was a flood of comments. Seriously? At her age, fighting over money? What a joke. She's not even blood. What makes her think she has any right? Always thought she was quiet. Guess she's got an agenda after all. I scrolled, each comment pressing harder on my chest like fists one after the other. I slammed the laptop shut and yanked the curtains closed. I didn't answer any calls that night. Not even Kathy's texts. It wasn't that I cared what they said. I wasn't that fragile. But the feeling of isolation, that I knew all too well. In the early years of my marriage to Robert, it had been the same. His family never invited me to holiday dinners. Let's keep things low-key for a few years, they'd say. His colleagues, who'd met me plenty of times, never spoke to me at parties, only to him. Even Michael back then accepted the birthday cake I baked with a quick flat, thanks. Just leave it there. And now they weren't just excluding me. They were pushing me right back to the edge, back into the role of outsider. I went to church. The sun was warm outside and children chased each other across the lawn. I stood at the entrance watching. I saw familiar faces go inside the chapel. But no one noticed me. I stood there for a long while. Then I turned around and walked away. That night I made a pot of pasta, but after a couple bites I couldn't eat anymore. I sat under the dim kitchen light, staring at the little note still stuck on the fridge. Robert's handwriting. Don't forget the meds. The ink had faded, but it was still there. And suddenly I couldn't stop crying. Not because I missed him, but because I finally admitted something to myself. I thought I'd moved on from that marriage. I hadn't. I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't. I didn't know if I could keep going. I picked up my phone and hovered my thumb over Deborah's number. I wanted to say maybe this wasn't worth it. Maybe we'd gone too far. But I didn't call. Instead, I went upstairs and opened the boxes of Robert's old things one by one. Not out of nostalgia. I just needed to know if my whole life had only ever been defined by him. At the bottom of the last box I found an old photograph. It was me in my 30s planting trees with a group of students on campus. I had a wide-brimmed sun hat on and I was laughing, really laughing. And then I remembered. One of my students gave me a handwritten card that year. It said, "Thank you for teaching me not to be afraid of making mistakes." That wasn't someone's wife. That wasn't someone's stepmother. That was me. The next morning I drove to the cemetery. I stood in front of Robert's headstone. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't deliver a long speech. I just said quietly, "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to reclaim what you refused to give me. My dignity. I took care of you because I chose to, not because I deserved to be erased." The breeze was soft, the trees casting mottled shadows across the grass. I stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back to my car. That evening I didn't do much of anything. I sat in the living room holding a cup of cold tea, staring out the window. Around 10 p.m. the TV switched to a rerun of Voices of the Readers. And that's when I remembered something. The next morning I opened my laptop and clicked on the website for the Morningtown Herald. There was a section labeled Submit a Story. My finger hovered for a few seconds over the mouse. Then I clicked. I wrote a letter. Not a complaint. Not a plea. Just a clear, honest record, like taking notes after class. I'm a 65-year-old retired teacher. For over a decade I cared for my husband through chronic illness, business struggles and family complications. After he passed, I discovered his will gave everything to his son from a previous marriage. As his legal spouse, I was left with nothing but a token sympathy stipend. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't beg. I went to court to request what I rightfully deserved. But what I received instead was public scorn. She's not blood. She lived there long enough. What more does she want? I know I'm not the only one. I just want to ask. Does being an elderly woman count for nothing in the eyes of the law? I didn't sign my full name. Just 2 letters, Cs. After I hit submit I didn't think much about it. It was just a way to release what I had been carrying. But 3 days later, Kathy burst into my yard, waving a newspaper in the air. "You didn't tell me you submitted this," she shouted, half laughing, half crying. She slammed the paper open on my table. The Morningtown Herald, op-ed section, front page. The headline read, "She cared for him 17 years, and was left with nothing. One woman's fight at the edge of the law." I stared at that line for a long time. For the first time I realized, what I'd lived through wasn't just my story. It was a public one. I rushed to the website. Under my article a comment thread had opened. Reading the responses I felt my throat tighten. My grandma went through the same thing. She never told anyone. She was too ashamed. Isn't it time elderly women were given legal recognition for what they do? So what if she's not blood? She was his wife. His partner for over a decade. A war that had been quiet for too long was lit by the flick of an anonymous signature. Deborah emailed me that evening. She said someone had reached out to her anonymously, asking how to protect themselves in a similar situation. He guessed it was because of the piece. I wrote back just one sentence. "We started the fire. Let it burn." But Michael didn't stay quiet for long. On the 5th day I received a letter by courier, an official warning from his law firm, accusing me of disseminating false statements about the deceased and his rightful heir, and threatening to pursue a defamation lawsuit if I didn't stop. I took a photo of the letter and sent it to Deborah. He called back, chuckling. "Looks like we hit a nerve. Can I keep talking?" I asked. "Absolutely," she said, then paused. "In fact, maybe it's time to stop hiding behind anonymity." I didn't answer right away. But after we hung up I opened the drawer, took out the warning letter and tore it to pieces. Not out of rage, but with a calmness that surprised even me. The more they feared my voice, the more I knew I was finally on the right path. That afternoon the associate editor of the Morningtown Herald called me. He said, "Readers really connected with your story. We'd like to do a follow-up interview. It won't be formal and there's no pressure to reveal your identity. If you prefer, we can mask your voice, use a pseudonym, whatever makes you comfortable." I paused. Just for a few seconds. Then I said, "No need. You can use my real name." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a gentle reply. "All right, Charlotte. We'll treat this story with care." After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I knew then, this wasn't just my story anymore. After the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Maybe Michael and his legal team saw the tide shifting. Maybe they feared the growing public pressure. Either way, they stopped stalling. They agreed to a court hearing. 2 days later, I got an email from Deborah. The case had officially entered the court system. A response from Michael's attorneys was expected soon. I replied with just one line. "I'm ready." The following Monday, Deborah texted me. "Everything's prepped. The court window opens today. We can file." I didn't hesitate. I wrote back one word. Go. When we arrived at the courthouse, I realized I'd walked past this white building so many times in my life, but I'd never truly stepped inside. We entered through the west entrance. Deborah led me up to the second floor, straight to the office for probate and family court filings. She took out the documents, laying them neatly on the counter, one after another. The clerk reviewed each form, stamp, record, number, file. Everything was precise, efficient. When we were handed the official receipt, Deborah gently slipped the paperwork back into her leather briefcase. She looked at me and said, "Now it's official. We've begun." I nodded. The overhead lights were harsh, but I didn't blink. As we reached the courthouse steps, Deborah stopped and turned to me. "You understand what this means, right?" Of course I did. Later that day I told Kathy. We were standing outside the cafe when I shared the news. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've got a feeling this fight won't be confined to the courtroom." He was right. The next day Michael's legal team issued a formal notice. They rejected all objections, stating they intended to uphold the decedent's testamentary intent and defend Michael's inheritance rights under the law. After reading the email, Deborah's response was brief. "He's going on the offensive. That means we can't afford to hold back." From that moment, everything accelerated. We needed evidence. We needed witnesses. We needed everything that could prove my role in Robert's life, the part no one saw written into a will. I turned the house upside down. I found Robert's medical bills, notebooks where I tracked his blood pressure, photos of our vacations, old tax returns we filed jointly, and every transfer receipt from my personal account to his when his business was struggling. I didn't throw a single slip of paper away. Deborah took it all. She organized it, filed it, annotated it. Then scheduled a Friday prep session. She looked me in the eye and said, "When you take the stand, you're not just a widow. You're the only person who can say out loud what these past years were really made of." I nodded. I started preparing. By day I sorted documents. By night I drafted my statement. I stood in front of the mirror telling my story out loud. By the third run the tears stopped. I wrote every possible question and answer on sticky notes and posted them on the fridge. I read them every morning. Deborah told me, "This isn't about proving who you are. It's about reminding yourself, you've always known." On the day of the hearing I wore a deep navy suit dress. Deborah had suggested the color, steady, understated, but strong. I stood in front of the mirror for a few seconds, brushing my hair back into a neat twist, then grabbed the folder of prepared documents and headed out the door. Deborah was already waiting outside the courthouse. She gave me a single nod. "Let's go. We're ready." We walked into courtroom 2. The lighting was dim and the air carried the scent of old wood and paper. Michael was already seated at the respondent's table, impeccably dressed in his usual suit, flanked by 2 lawyers. When he saw me, he didn't nod or speak. He looked at me like I was an unexpected complication, something that didn't fit neatly into his version of events. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, adjusted my breathing, and kept my eyes on the judge's bench. My palms were damp, but I refused to show a single sign of hesitation. The judge, a woman in her 50s, had a calm, deliberate manner. She read the basic case summary aloud, then gave a small nod. "The plaintiff may proceed with their opening statement." Deborah stood. Her voice was even, steady. She explained the core of the case, that Robert, without his spouse's knowledge or consent, had attempted to initiate a property transfer agreement and circumvent legally protected spousal rights through incomplete, informal documentation. She concluded and turned to me. "Miss Charlotte, please take the stand." I stood up and walked to the witness box. The sound of my heels on the wood floor echoed. Each step felt like moving from the kitchen to the center of the world. The judge looked at me. "Please describe your relationship to the deceased, your role in the shared household, and the grounds for your objection to the will." I nodded, my voice trembling slightly but holding firm. I was Robert's spouse. We were legally married for 10 years. We didn't have children, but we shared a home, a life, and responsibilities. During our marriage, I was his primary caregiver through multiple health conditions. I managed his medications, his diet, accompanied him to appointments. During a financial crisis at his company, I even provided support from my personal retirement savings. I paused, then continued. Until the day he died, I was never told of his final financial arrangements. It wasn't until I was sorting through his belongings months later that I found the will, leaving everything to his son from a previous marriage. I turned toward the judge. He didn't mention me in that will. Not even once. All he left was a small, temporary sympathy fund. I steadied my tone. I'm not here to take what isn't mine. I'm here to claim my rightful place as a spouse. As someone who was there. Every single day. The room was silent. Even the sound of paper shuffling seemed amplified. Then Michael's attorney rose. A textbook corporate lawyer. Measured, clinical, impersonal. We emphasize that the deceased was of sound mind and free will when he drafted this will. His decision to allocate assets to his biological heir does not, in itself, violate any legal provision. He paused, glancing down at his notes. And the plaintiff has yet to provide sufficient evidence that her role in the marriage extended beyond ordinary domestic contribution to a legally significant economic impact. I held my breath. But Deborah stood immediately. Calm but fierce. We have submitted supporting documentation including medical bills, shared account expenditures, photographs, and voice recordings. These establish that Ms. Charlotte not only fulfilled caretaking duties but also contributed financially, pulling from her own pension to help sustain Robert's business during its downturn. She turned slightly toward the judge. This is not an attempt to undermine Robert's intent. It is an effort to uphold the legal entitlements of a spouse under state law. The judge nodded. I have received the documentation and will consider it during deliberation. The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours. Finally, the judge said, "This case will be held for decision. Both parties are to submit any remaining materials, including witness statements and rebuttals, within the next 7 days." We stepped out of the courtroom into the blinding afternoon sun. Deborah gently touched my arm and smiled. "You did great." I nodded. "I know. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. But something deep in my chest, something heavy, had finally begun to loosen. On the day of the ruling, Deborah told me she could go alone to hear the verdict. "These decisions usually aren't read out in court," she said lightly, trying to reassure me. "Just wait for my call." But I went anyway. I arrived 15 minutes early, standing at the base of the courthouse steps, staring up at that familiar stretch of marble. My heartbeat was slow but heavy. When Deborah came out of the judge's chambers, her expression was unreadable. I held my breath. I didn't ask. She walked up to me, handed me a stack of documents and said softly, "We won." For a second I didn't react. I just stared at her, blank. "The court ruled that you are legally entitled to half of the remaining assets in Robert's accounts," she said, flipping through the paperwork. "As for the house, because of procedural flaws in the attempted transfer, the court has deemed it invalid. The property is restored to joint ownership." My lips parted. "So, I can keep living there?" "Yes," she nodded. "You own 50% of the property. If Michael wants to keep the other half, he'll need to negotiate with you. You can offer to buy him out, or propose a joint sale." I exhaled slowly, a deep breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just stood there, feeling the weight that had pressed against my ribs for so long finally start to lift. Michael wasn't there. His lawyer picked up the judgment papers and left in a hurry, issuing a one-line statement. They reserved the right to appeal. But Deborah said, "That's likely where it ends. If he really wants to keep fighting," she added, calm as ever, "he'll have to think hard about public opinion and his nearly depleted legal budget." Sure enough, the next day the Morningtown Herald ran my full interview on the front page. The headline didn't mince words. She wasn't a stepmother. She was the legal wife, and she was written out. The article wasn't dramatic. It simply laid out the facts, how the case unfolded, what the court said, and how the town responded. Below the main text was a quote from my courtroom testimony. The comment section lit up. "She's so brave. Most people would have stayed silent." That line, "I wasn't a maid or a volunteer," I read it 3 times. Hit me right in the chest. I used to think she was just quiet. Now I know that was the silence before the storm. That whole day I received over a dozen emails from anonymous readers. They were short, but each one cracked something in me open. "Thank you for saying it out loud. My mother was pushed out just like you. She never understood why. You're not alone." At 4 p.m. I walked into Kathy's cafe. She had already set out 2 vanilla lattes. When she saw me, she raised her cup and grinned. "Welcome back, warrior." I took mine and smiled too. Not because I'd won the case, but because for the first time, I had been seen. Neighbors who once only nodded at church now stopped to chat. One even slipped me a note saying she'd love to talk if I ever had time, about the quiet years in her marriage, the ones where she felt invisible. This wasn't attention. It wasn't vanity. It was a small patch of earth I'd reclaimed for myself. A place where I was finally someone. When I got home, I paused in the entryway. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, familiar and worn. The wall sconce still broken. The old coffee table. I'd painted that with my own hands years ago. I whispered to myself, "You held me down for so many years. But today I walked out of you." That wasn't for Robert. It wasn't for Michael. It was for the woman I used to be, the one who swallowed her voice. Starting today, I would live with shape, with sound, with a name. A week later I called Michael. His voice on the other end was cool, but the superiority was gone. That air of untouchable confidence had thinned. "We need to talk about the house," I said, getting straight to the point. He paused. "What are you proposing?" "You've got 2 options," I said. 1, I buy out your 50% ownership at market value. 2, we list the house together, sell it, and split the net profit. He gave a short, almost scoffing laugh. "You think you can afford that?" I didn't bite. Kept my voice even. "I've already received part of the account distribution. The rest is clearing through probate. The bank approved a temporary funding bridge. And the interview I did? The article's publication fee hit my account last week." I paused, then added, "And to be clear, I'm not asking you for anything. I'm giving you 2 choices. What you do with them is up to you." There was a silence on the line, longer than I expected. In the end, he chose the joint sale. 2 months later, the house was listed and sold for slightly more than we'd projected. When all the papers were signed, I stood alone in the empty living room, taking one last look at the space where I had cooked, arranged flowers, wiped counters, and swallowed years of silence. I felt strangely calm. There wasn't much sentimentality left. This place had once trapped me in a quiet, invisible role. Now I had turned its ending into my beginning. With my share of the proceeds, I rented a small storefront right next to Kathy's cafe in the center of town. On the day of renovations, Kathy came by and peeked through the window. "You're really opening a shop?" she grinned. "What kind of shop?" I handed her a piece of paper. My plan was written in plain handwriting. Morning, quilting and textile workshop. Afternoon, women's legal rights discussion circle. She blinked at it, then laughed. "You're combining social hour with a feminist revolution?" "At my age," I smiled, "if I don't make a little noise, I might grow old too quietly." We named the workshop Charlotte's name. Kathy picked it. She said, "This is the name of everything you fought to reclaim." On the wall, just above the front window, I pinned a line from my courtroom testimony. "We are not maids. We are not volunteers. We are part of the marriage. We are the other half of life." At first, only a handful of women showed up. Some retired ladies, a quiet young girl, and one middle-aged woman who wandered in hesitant, saying she was just passing by. But slowly the seats began to fill. Mothers came with daughters. Grandmothers brought granddaughters to sew. A nurse started coming every week after her shift. One afternoon she pulled me aside and said, "I listened to your interview at least 10 times. It was like you were speaking my mom's truth." I didn't talk about the case anymore. I talked about what comes after 60. Do we still get to have a voice? Do we still get to choose? Can we rewrite the story of who we are? No one ever gave me answers. But in the sharing, in the listening, I found a way to ask those questions out loud. And let other women speak for themselves. I no longer needed anyone's permission. I no longer needed to fit anyone's plan. This life, I'm writing it in my own name. Every morning, I brew myself a cup of coffee, flip through the paper, and hang the sign on my front door. "Welcome. You have a name." One afternoon, a neighbor who used to give me nothing more than a cold nod passed by. She slowed as she read the words on the sign, hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. Her voice was low, almost fragile. "I once called you greedy. Back then I didn't know the whole story. I'm sorry." I looked at her, smiled gently, and said, "I heard what you said. But I didn't fall." She blinked, caught off guard, then smiled too. She later became one of my most faithful quilting class regulars. As for Michael, I never spoke to him again. Not out of hatred, but because I'd finally understood. Some lines need to be redrawn. He no longer had a place in my present. And he no longer defined my worth. He existed only in that chapter of my life. And I had closed the book. One day Kathy handed me a card. Inside was a single line. What you reclaimed wasn't just your rights, it was your dignity. I stared at those words for a long time, then taped the card inside my shop's front door. Most people only see it on their way out. Some read it and nod. Some pause for a second. And every day I stand behind that door quietly watching them walk away. They leave more confident. Lighter. Like me. All my life I cooked for others, cleaned up their messes, waited for approval. Took me too long to realize. Life isn't a service. It's a declaration. So from today forward I declare. I am me, whole, free and named,